So I'm going to begin with introducing, maybe some of you have heard of this practice, and it could be helpful too. If you have something to make notes with, maybe just write something down, because you're going to use some of your ideas that you come up with to maybe talk about a little later in our session today. So like a notebook, a piece of paper, something to write with. You can even use your computer maybe to make notes. Let's see here. I'm going to turn off my email because it's beeping at me. Hold on, I'm sorry. Okay, so what I first like to do as we're going to be exploring the concepts of spirituality and religion. And that can be pretty intellectual, meaning that can really take up a ton of headspace. And that's great. That is great. I love intellectual exercises. However, it is really what will really help us to really kind of know the material or get to know what we're talking about is to also connect with our heart space, our imagination, and our creative thinking. And this spiritual practice, it can help support that on this journey. The spiritual practice is called Lectio Divina. It was developed by a group of Catholic priests in the 6th century. And it was created by these priests to really engage with the scripture. They wanted to really deeply listen to it, not just read it, but listen to it and have it really kind of absorb into their way of life so that they would be acting out of the sacred text that they were reading. It was introduced to me years and years and years ago. Probably 30 plus years ago. And I really enjoyed it. And I do use this spiritual practice throughout my readings of almost anything, whether it's spiritual text or even watching a movie. This practice can help us listen with not just our ears and read with our eyes, but listen to something that gets touched in our souls. So it is a 4-step process that starts off either reading the text or watching or looking at something. And then it goes to meditation, and then to prayer, and then to contemplation. And I'll go more into that of what that all looks like as we do this practice. What I thought would be interesting, and others have done this too, is they pick either a sacred text to read from, or they actually pick like poetry or something meaningful. And what I decided would be interesting is to use this spiritual practice while reading an 800-year-old poem by the Sufi mystic Rumi. So as we first read this poem, I'm going to share the poem in the screen so that you can read it as I read it to you. I want you to note what stands out to you. Is there a part of the text that draws you in? Is there something that resonates with you? Is there anything that makes you feel uncomfortable or perhaps leaves you with some questions? Take notes as you start to listen to and look at this poem. And then you're going to take anything that comes up to you, a phrase, an image, into the second step. So I'm going to share my screen first with you. Here it is. Can you guys see this? You can just nod your heads. Yeah? Okay, good. So this poem is called The Guest House, and it's one of my favorites of Rumi. So I'm going to just start to read it, and you can also read it, and let's just see what comes up for you. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So I'd like you to just kind of sit with the words, maybe even look at this poem again, maybe read it one more time to yourself. I'm just going to take a few moments to just allow you to feel it, to listen to it. Is there anything that comes up for you? Now I'd like you to jot that down, and we will do the next step. Let's see. Let me stop sharing my screen. So the next step is, I want you to take any image or phrase that's come to you, and I'd like you to kind of settle into your seat, take a deep breath through your nose, out your mouth, roll your shoulders, and get comfortable. I'd like you to wiggle your toes. Hopefully have both feet on the ground if you do, or if you're sitting cross-legged, just make sure you feel those sit bones. And I'm gonna time us for about a minute. And I'd like you to sit with that phrase and that image. And we're just gonna be silent for a minute. All right. So the next step, now the step we just did, you can take as long as you want, like if you wanted to do this practice by yourself. And because sometimes sitting with the phrase or the meaning and letting the feelings emerge and kind of letting them sink in, it gives us more. It kind of starts to illuminate something that's coming, like that's going on inside of us. And that would be a great time to continue to like journal and continue to just kind of feel, like write out feeling words, journal about what is going on through this interaction with the text. The third step of Lectio Divina is prayer. Now, I don't know any of your practices. I don't know where any of you are coming from, but prayer basically is this communication to the God of your own understanding, or to nature, or to self. Really, it's a communication outside of oneself, either verbally or on paper. So in this next moment, I'd like you to explore that phrase that stood out to you initially. And as you pray, and I'm only going to take another maybe 1 minute for this, and we're going to pray to ourselves, not out loud. You can either journal your prayer or share any of the feelings that came up for you, and take note of any new insight that may have was given to you regarding the text, or what awakened inside of you through your phrase. So right now, I'd like you to settle in and kind of pray to yourself on paper, on text, or inside. And I'll give you a minute for that. And the fourth and last stage, as your prayer, it's called contemplation. And as your prayer comes to close, this is where you would spend some time contemplating what happened within you throughout the time of the reading and the meditation and the prayer. You would just bring to mind any new insights you had received during this time, whether personal or in relation to the text, and you let it sink in. And you actually start to allow it to color your way of being in that moment. And you might be surprised how much a simple and quiet process can alter your perspective and give you new direction. This exercise helps us check into what our interior world is reacting to or resonating with. It is so helpful to check into this inner place, to develop your inner knowing, to develop that intuition. So as we journey together in the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like you to listen to what resonates with you and what doesn't quite fit. It is a practice of being aware of how words of somebody else or other texts affect you, and how to start to begin to discern what our interior consciousness is saying in reaction to somebody else's words or the text we're reading. So I'm going to begin with my story now. And I said I was going to take a break after that spiritual experience, but we've only been doing this for 15 minutes, so I'm thinking we're going to be okay. So I'm going to tell my story, and then we'll take a little break to move and get a drink and go do what we need to do. So my story is I was raised by two very loving parents who had very strong beliefs about who, what, where God is. We were taught from a very young age the right way to practice our religion. My father was trained in performing the rites and rituals as a pastor of a small community called the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quaker movement. Quakers, or the Friends as they were called, they're a Protestant denomination that was founded in 17th century England. They were actually persecuted for their beliefs because they believed in the radical idea that God exists in every person. So they also rejected the ideas of elaborate religious ceremonies, like at the time the Anglican religion and Catholicism. And they did not have an official clergy. There were no priests in the Quaker movement. They actually practiced pacifism, which is interesting because my father was also a Marine, and he finished his service right before he went into divinity school. So here he came out of a very military background with some pretty rigid rules and ideas, and then actually had a spiritual experience through people from the Quaker movement, and it guided him to decide to become a minister in the Quaker movement. And he did practice pacifism, nonviolence. Quakers also played a real key role in the abolitionist and women's rights movement. Quakers were known for their radical ideas that all men are created equal, no matter what color of their skin. So though our brand of Christianity was fairly progressive and egalitarian, the gender roles were still very concrete and inflexible. Women were still cast in a supportive role where the men led and provided, and women were not allowed to teach or hold positions of authority over men within the church. Women were to submit to the patriarchy, expressed in obeying God, and then man, and then kind of in the hierarchy of things came woman and then child. Our family had established routines. My father studied and created his sermons and met with parishioners throughout the week. My mother cared for us 5 kids at home full time. I am the eldest of 5, and we are all rather close in age. It was a vibrant household, to say the least. However, at the time when I was probably around 1st or 2nd grade, factions had developed within the church my father led. And eventually my father stepped down from his role as pastor there. His brother was also very involved in the church, and he did not like the role or he didn't like the direction my father was taking when we left the Friends Church. As we became involved in another movement, and it was a startup movement called the Vineyard. The Vineyard movement, and this was in Southern California, just to give you a little context of where we are. The Vineyard movement began in the 1970s and was considered a non-denominational form of Christianity that was actually made up of a lot of former Quakers, rock stars, and actors. They embrace the idea that one could experience the Holy Spirit through songs, healing, and prophecy. My first memory of a church service there was when I was in about the 3rd or 4th grade and saw these adults laying hands upon one another, praying for healing. Also a lot of crying, shaking, shouting, and people were actually falling over. I was both intrigued and a little scared of what I experienced. It was very different than a Quaker religious service. My uncle, who of course was a Quaker, was very vocal about his disagreement with my father's direction and wouldn't miss an opportunity to tell my father that he was a heretic. This made a very strong impression on me. I soon became aware of the many disagreements within the Christian community. Some believed baptism should be provided when a child was young. Some others believe that you shouldn't be baptized until you were 18. Some believe baptism should be full immersion into water, and others believed in a sprinkling of water. There was a rift. The rift that caused my father to leave the church denomination was due to his growing belief in faith healing, speaking in tongues, and prophecy. My mother also grew more ardent in her display of these behaviors, so much so that if I admitted I had a cold or I was sick, she would lay hands on me and speak in a strange voice with unintelligible words. I was troubled by that. So I learned to admit that I was never sick. So I never admitted I was sick. My parents would have people over once a week to read scriptures, sing, and pray for one another. One memory I have is a group of adults surrounding my 3-year-old brother at the time. He had been diagnosed with hearing loss and was having some pretty severe problems with that. He was having a hard time speaking. And he was due to go into surgery the following week to get tubes put in his ears. And I just remember the leader of the group putting hands on his ears and my brother actually starting to cry, saying his ears were burning up. And then the next day finding out that my parents, when they went to the doctors, I think it was the next day, I actually don't remember when, the doctor said, I don't know what happened, but he no longer needs tubes put in his ears. So things were happening that were unexplainable. And with my young mind, it was amazing. Like I believed in all of it. When I was 12 years old, we moved from Anaheim, California to rural Arizona. My father had just been diagnosed with melanoma cancer. He had had several surgeries to remove the cancerous tissue, and that was that. We were coached by our religious community to have faith, to believe in my father's healing, And on the outside, he looked very healthy. He was very busy with several businesses to keep our family financially afloat. He and his friend built our house that summer in Arizona. We made friends. We started to get invested in our community. However, I was really starting to become aware of an interior restlessness. I was extremely insecure. I had a ton of social anxiety. I also felt like there was this deep, dark abyss inside of me that I couldn't be satiated. When I was 14 years old, I experimented with marijuana and alcohol. I liked how it felt. However, I lost complete control of my senses when I drank. I was unable to keep myself safe and became vulnerable to be taken advantage of by older boys. I was searching for acceptance and serenity and desperate for those elusive moments of peace. Toward the end of that year, my father started experiencing intense pain in his abdomen. The cancer had metastasized, and within 5 months, it was a week and a half before I turned 15, my father died. We were ill prepared for the sudden shift of our situation. For one thing, we did not talk about the possibility of him dying. We never even planned for it. My mother and us children were thrown into impoverished living conditions overnight. We didn't have adequate medical insurance, so we lost our home, we lost our land, we lost everything. With the help of family members, we moved back to California and lived on food stamps and government subsidized food for quite a while. I started distancing myself from everybody. I would go through the motions of going to school, attending church. However, the intensity of grief and loneliness was unbearable. And I found myself in a company of other kids who like to smoke and drink and carry on ways that I'm sure my mother and the community disapproved of. I had already become a master of disguises. I was really good at appearing like I was doing well. I went to church, I attended all the functions, I hung out with my church friends, and at times there were moments I felt God. However, I was so disenchanted with life that I continued to inhale and smoke and drink things that would keep me in a numbed out state. Our prayers and rituals and practices did not sustain me during this time. Fear and shame-based thought patterns continued to guide me toward hopelessness. I had no tools to deal with the suffocating grief and the shame of feeling inherently bad and painfully alone. I felt like I was a disappointment to God and to my mom and to my dad, really. I thought that he was looking at me from heaven and really saying, just shaking his head going, what is your problem? So as I became more disconnected from the religion and spiritual practices of my childhood, I upped my search for something to fill that ever deepening sense of dread inside of me. Well, one day I was waitressing at Bob's Big Boy, and I was serving an elderly couple their lunch. And this was a couple that would come in every week. They actually rarely left a tip, so it wasn't a fun experience for me. They would always leave these little tracts about how Jesus could save you. Well, that one day, and I'll always remember it, this woman reached out her hand and she put her hand on my hand. And I thought she was actually going to give me a tip. So I placed my hand out, and then she put this piece of paper in my hand. I'm like, oh, good God, it's one of these tracts again. However, I looked at it, and then I looked at her, and she told me this. She said, I see the pain in your eyes, and I know that Jesus can help you. And there was something inside me that kind of reacted to that, and I was just like, oh, God. But I was nice, and I was kind. And I took that little pamphlet, I put it in my pocket, and I turned away from the table, kind of rolling my eyes. But something needled at me, and I felt drawn to go to this thing. So the event was a Billy Graham crusade that was being held at the Angel Stadium. And I was familiar with Billy Graham. I grew up in an evangelical type household, and he was kind of a household name. And he kind of had this grandfatherly look to him. And I just thought, what the heck? I'm going to go and see what it's all about. So I collected actually several of my friends. And at the time I was driving a orange with white top VW Volkswagen bus. We called it the party van. So me and my friends, we're all stoners. We all pass the joint around, get as high as we can. We walk into the Angel Stadium, and tell you the truth, I don't remember what happened that night, except that I woke up the next day really knowing I needed to go back, but I needed to go back sober and clear-minded. So I went back by myself the following night, and I actually wept through the entire event. I felt Billy Graham was talking right to me with such love and acceptance. So I made a decision right then and there to turn my life back to God and to start seeking the things of God. So I went down to the field. I did all of the words that they told me to do. And that day I quit smoking pot and drinking alcohol. I attended Bible college after high school. I went to church more. And yet the restlessness inside of me drove me to leave California to search for something else. I thought maybe a change of location would help me. I was craving freedom. I was craving something. So I decided to move to Chicago with my best friend. And that's a whole other story on how we made that decision. Well, I met a boy. I was married by age 21. I had my first child at 23, my second child at 27. I was doing my best to practice my faith. However, I was haunted by anxiety and depression, and nobody knew about it. I was so good at making everyone around me believe that there was nothing wrong with me. My religious practice was fueled by a deep fear of not doing life right and maybe even going to hell. And if I didn't raise my kids the right way, maybe they would go to hell. I was very involved at church. I led Bible studies. I went to church twice a week. I made sure I was teaching my kids about God. However, I had another life. In my other life, I was also binge drinking on the weekends with my friends from the restaurant I worked at. And at times I was barely able to even drive home safely. I did what I'd always done. I kept very busy, pushing myself to accomplish things. I went back to school. I began working full time. I volunteered at the kids' school. I served at church. And in those quiet moments in the middle of the night, I was gripped by intense loneliness and desperation. My marriage was disintegrating. The word divorce was being thrown around. I felt panicked. How could I divorce when my religious upbringing completely forbade it? I tried even harder. I tried praying more. I went to more church services. We got a marriage therapist. However, I was also still numbing out through excessive use of novel reading, TV watching, drinking wine, anything to keep me from that still quiet place inside of me. What was happening? Was my religion failing me? Was I just not spiritual enough? Why could I not do what I really, really wanted to do? All I really wanted was a sense of connection and serenity. I was very religious, and I was practicing spirituality in the ways my religion dictated. So we're going to pause in my story, and we will get back to it. Let's talk about those words, religion and spirituality. I'd like you to even feel those words, religion. What happens for you when I say that? Spirituality, does anything come up? Because it can conjure up some pretty strong feelings in some of us. I don't know about you, but when I think of the word religion, I may think of it as a certain belief system that has in history been used to hurt people. It's been used to separate people. It's been used to judge people. When I think of the word spirituality, I think of it more of as a practice, perhaps to strengthen my connection to myself and to others. Both words do have definitions and describe a means to understand something greater than ourselves, something that exists beyond our physical senses of sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch. In religion, that something greater than the self usually is an entity or entities that are clearly defined, obeyed, and worshiped. Whereas in spirituality, there is an openness to whether there is an entity or not, and can be thought of through the lens of religion or not. One can be spiritual and not believe in God. However, one can believe in God and practice spirituality. Spirituality differs from traditional religious practices in that the focus is on personal growth, authenticity, congruency, and wholeness. It is the process of becoming less egocentric and more connected to self and others through relationship and unity. It is the exploration of one's purpose and direction related to something greater than the self. Traditional religions also have pathways to similar concepts of spirituality, but can have more structure, sometimes dualistic thinking, like there is a defined right and wrong, a yes and no. There are absolutes in religion at times that cannot be refuted. So maybe we can think of religion instead of absolutes that cannot be refuted, but perhaps signposts along the way of life, markers that do their best to explain the path ahead. Perhaps those markers describe things like the terrain, the mileage, and the tourist attractions that you don't want to miss. Perhaps religion was man's attempt to define this inner spirituality that was already within us. Perhaps spirituality is an instinct, just like the instinct to live, the instinct to eat, the instinct to make babies. So spirituality, maybe instead of as just being signpost, is more the choices we take every step we go. Like, what's next should I bring on the journey? What should I wear? Do I have the right shoes? Which shoes should I wear? And which path do I want to take? Do I want to go through the forest? Do I want to go into the desert? Do I want to visit the lake? So the major religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have this shared set of beliefs and practices that many times are really concerned about our afterlife. What do I do with what I have today to determine where I go, like heaven or hell? Heaven and hell are concepts that are firmly embedded in religious belief systems. In spirituality, the existence of heaven and hell are not absolute ideas. I was taught through my religious training certain ways to think of both heaven and hell. Both places have a location. Heaven was a place where the chosen go. The place was described as having streets of gold, mansions, and where one was always happy and never sad. I remember having a talk with my dad as an 8-year-old about one of our dogs who had just died. I'm like, do dogs go to heaven? I don't remember my dad's answer. But I do believe that his face said it all, and he just looked kind and loving to me. And I thought, of course animals go to heaven. As I grew up in the church, I was told only certain people go to heaven. These people have to say certain words and live a certain kind of life. There were things that you could do to be certain about going to heaven. You had to be saved by repenting and saying certain words. In the Christian culture, at least the one I grew up in, heaven was the reward in the afterlife for a virtuous life that was lived here on earth. How I've come to understand spirituality is that spirituality is more concerned with the here and now. Concepts of heaven and hell are more indicative of states of mind. Spirituality or spiritual practice is not about doing things that get me somewhere in the afterlife, but about creating a sustainable life on earth that's filled with purpose and meaning. Neither the teachings of Jesus or the ancient scriptures clearly supported the idea of an afterlife, of paradise or eternal pain and suffering. And maybe this is the news to some of you. I know it was news to me, but through much research, I've come to discover that ancient Jews did not believe that the soul could be separated from the body, that the soul was more like the breath we breathe. In fact, the word God, Yahweh, used in the Old Testament, they think Yahweh is actually Yahweh, sounding like an in-breath and an out-breath. Yahweh. So ancient Jews thought once a person stopped breathing, that breath, that person was gone and was reduced to dust. However, ancient Jewish thought started to change. And around the time of Jesus, Jewish thought started to change toward that maybe the soul was permanent. And perhaps there was this idea that one would die, but then be resurrected into something else, but still not a heaven. There was not a divine place someone would go to, but really Jesus talked about actually a new earth. And those early writers of the New Testament talked about this new earth would get created by the people who thought differently. Jesus preached that those who are fully devoted to the main tenets of God's law, love God with your entire being and love your neighbor as yourself, would live on to develop and create this new earth where they talk about the lion lay with the lamb, where there was no violence, where human consciousness would reach a place of peace and end suffering. Something to note, and I found this interesting in my research, that eternity is not even a Jewish concept. There's no such thing in the Jewish mind as eternal life. Eternity was translated in the Bible from a word name, it's called aeon, A-I-O-N, which means age, not forever. So anytime if you're reading the Bible and you see the word eternal, it's actually meaning the ages or ages to come. The expression of the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God occurs over 85 times in the New Testament. That's a lot of times to be mentioned in a book. And when something's repeated over and over and over again, I find my little antenna perking up. In Matthew 13, Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven in vibrant stories of farmers, landowners, bakers, fishermen, businessmen, owners, and lottery winners. In each story, there is a human engaging in their day-to-day life, and then something difficult happens. There are weeds in the garden that need to get pulled up. There are fish caught in a net. Some are good and some are bad fish. Jesus talks about what to do with the things that aren't serving. When you pull the weeds, you take the ones you don't want and you burn them. When you catch these fish, and some are good and some are bad, the bad ones you throw back. The kingdom of heaven is the work of human beings to practice justice and mercy in an intentional way. Jesus's stories go over and over and over again about how to know your own prejudices and resentments, how to be purified by acknowledging your wrongs and making things right. The kingdom of heaven is a spiritual practice, not necessarily belonging to a certain group that believes they're going somewhere after this life, but it's like a daily practice. What am I creating today? Am I creating heaven? Or am I creating hell? The word hell is not even mentioned in the Bible. It's a word that Jesus uses to translate, well, he uses the word Gehenna. And it's actually a name of a town dump outside the walls of Jerusalem. It's a city dump where refuse was burned all the time. 24 hours a day. In fact, they say that you would have seen the smoke and the fire from within the city walls. You would actually see it rising up over the city walls. There was also wild dogs that used to run around then, and they would fight over the scraps, and they would describe that as gnashing of teeth. There is a term in the New Testament called gnashing of teeth, weeping and gnashing of teeth. It was considered a place that Jesus used to make a point. He was telling a story, and he was using a metaphor to make a point. He was using it to dramatically describe what happens to a person who is so indifferent, so full of anger or lust that they would likely hurt themselves and others. He's talking about how people behave toward one another. Perhaps he's talking about generational trauma, which creates its own kind of hell, or how violence begets violence and how abuse begets abuse. Jesus did not describe hell as a place where people would go and be tormented for eternity. He certainly didn't ascribe to the notion that a loving God would damn anyone to pain and suffering. The concept of eternal torment for sinners came several centuries later after Jesus' death. Let me say this again. Eternal torment did not become part of Christian doctrine for several hundreds of years after the death of Christ. It was St. Augustine that really cemented the whole idea of eternal torment, not just for the wicked, but actually for anyone not Christian. He can be also thanked for the ideas of purgatory. Augustine's ideas became hateful Christian doctrine that fueled movements like the Inquisition and torture that the church began to initiate on those that did not agree with them. The doctrine of hell has also been used to control masses through fear. And yet in the New Testament, in the book 1 John, chapter 4, verse 18, there's a verse that says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. So spiritually speaking, hell is disconnection from the self and from the divine, the God within. It is separation from all that is good and beautiful. It is not eternal separation, however. There is always hope for one to reconcile to self and to others. And perhaps that's what the biblical writers meant. Repent, the kingdom of God is near. At any time you can start over. We can remember and realize heaven is inside of us, it's around us, it's everywhere, and we can join it. So if hell is a place where the fire burns continually, maybe it's a good kind of burning, a purifying burning, something that burns off everything that doesn't serve us, something that burns off all that's not love. Perhaps heaven is the essence of who we are after we walk through the fire. Perhaps we go through cycles of heaven and hell every day. What steps do we join the divine dance to create heaven on earth? What do we need to throw upon the refuse pile to get burned away? Our thoughts, feelings, and actions create heaven and hell. So there I was in my own private hell. My children started to refuse to go to church in their adolescence. And at the same time, I was in the middle of a very messy and angry divorce. I was being judged by family members and church members. I was being told to stay married for the sake of the children. I was told that God hates divorce, but I couldn't do it anymore. I felt my soul dying. Something shifted inside of me. I became desperate. So I took a leap of faith and listened to my heart, and I let it guide me. I got divorced. And in the next decade, I would gradually leave the church. I would get some really good therapy, and I would heal some pretty significant past trauma, and I would get sober. I have developed a deep and life-giving spirituality that sustains me. My childhood upbringing helped provide concrete and foundational truths that I interweave in my daily practice. You know, religion can help us. It can help us share language and context that can support us in our spiritual journey. So in conclusion, as we deal with tensions between ancient traditions and new ideas, conformity and questioning, guilt and freedom, self-interest and unselfishness, we slowly recognize the need to take responsibility for our own positions, commit to beliefs that ring true to our deepest self, while remaining open and tolerant. Namaste.